Hi, everyone. So I'm super excited to share with you the things I learned about my documentary. So let me share this screen with you, and then we can get started. Okay, so for my documentary, I chose to look at the film Bedlam, an intimate look into America's mental health crisis. So first and foremost, a brief introduction about the film. Why did I choose this documentary? Here are some statistics for you. In 2018, 1 in 5 American adults, or 47.6 million people, experienced mental illness, and 1 in 6 youth, or 7.7 million of them, experienced mental illness in 2016. And then only around half of both of these groups saw any form of treatment. Also, depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide. I chose to analyze this film for two reasons. First of all, I am one of the 5. I have previous experience with mental illness, and I'm also a mental health researcher. And so I saw the trailer for this film and got really excited about it and wanted to see what they were talking about. It's also actually a book. I haven't read the book. I have heard about the book, but hopefully soon I can order it and see how it expands on the film. Okay, so the context, ideology, and purpose of the documentary. First and foremost, some context for you. This documentary follows Dr. Rosenberg and his team basically on different trips to different places to tell the stories of people who have mental illness. So they visit an ER, they visit homeless camps, prisons, and also his childhood home. You can see him pictured here. And then the main idea is that because of deinstitutionalization, which was basically when long-term mental health hospitals were closed, people were thrown out on the streets, left to fend for themselves, and it caused a lot of problems. It especially caused a lot of problems for people who need more long-term care and can't necessarily get what they need by going to a community mental health center. Another problem with this is that there wasn't a lot of great follow-through because the plan was to close the hospitals and build community mental health centers, but not as many of them were built as there should have been. So the ideology has 3 main points. First of all, Americans with mental illness aren't treated well by society or by the mental health care system. One of the ER nurses, she's actually a trauma psychiatrist. She referred to the system as a revolving door because people come in the ER, they get temporary treatment, but they can't keep them long term to help them get the right care that they need. So then they get kicked back out on the streets. Secondly, Americans with mental illness deserve to be treated better. Mental illness is not a choice. It is just something that happens, and we have to learn to manage and get treatment and get better. And then also the third point, kind of like we we're talking about just now, the revolving door, it's basically just a vicious cycle as far as the mental health care system in this country. So the purpose, first, it allowed Dr. Rosenberg to tell the story about how his sister struggled with schizophrenia. You can see her in this picture. I believe this is her and her husband, if I remember correctly. They got married and then got divorced, and then a year later, she started showing signs of schizophrenia. Apparently, she had had some problems when she was younger, but this is when it got really bad. She was wandering the streets and found her way to their sister's house. Second, this documentary exposes treatment conditions for people with mental illness. It shows visits to the ER, how they're treated there. It shows how many people are living on the streets. And it also shows how these type of illnesses aren't something sometimes that just goes away. It's not like you get treatment and then it just disappears. Now, for some people, that's true, but that's not always the case. So, identification of the propagandist and the structure of the organization is our next section. These are the propagandists, basically Dr. Rosenberg and his team. So, Dr. Rosenberg was a director, producer, and a writer. Peter Miller was co-writer. Jim Krejci was editor. Joan Churchill was a co-producer and photography director. And then Danny and Sonder composed the music, which shout out to them. We'll talk about the soundtrack in a little bit. And then Jesse was an impact producer. Alan Barker was the director for location sound, but there wasn't a picture of him on the website. Okay, so the structure of the organization, a lot of different organizations went and gave their financial support or other types of support to help this documentary get done. So here you can see the list, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the Fledgling Fund, International Documentary Association, things like that. So things like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and Independent Lens, they helped stream the documentary compared to like Peg's Foundation gave financial support. So all of these different organizations have a different structure, but what I thought was really interesting was how they all came together to support this cause. Okay, the target audience. The target audience is pretty simple. First and foremost, the target audience is the general public, because people who have not had experience with this issue may not know a lot about it. And then mental health researchers, I would say that this group is a target for this film because of some of the stats it includes. So I'm not clearly on, the front lines of researching cures or anything like that, but I'm more on the qualitative side of things, like how do people cope? How does creativity help them? And so I thought this was a really good film for me because now I have some ideas about what I might could do for interviews in the future. Okay, and then media utilization techniques. There are a few techniques that I thought were really done well. First and foremost, they included definitions on screen of the different mental illnesses they covered, including bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, and suicide. So I thought that was really well done because you can see the definition on the screen and it helps you kind of process the full extent of whatever illness is being shown. Scene transitions are also another interesting thing. There's one scene where Dr. Rosenberg has gone back home for the first time since his sister died. And he's with his brother-in-law that's married to his other sister, not the one with schizophrenia, but the other sister. And they're, sitting there talking about, well, I feel like I could have done this better, and we shouldn't have taken her out of a mental health facility. That was not the right choice, but it was my parents' decision at the time. And he's flipping through a photo album of pictures of the family. And he gets to one picture of all of them, and he says, this was the happiest year of my family, but I also think this was the last happy year of my family. And when he flips it over, it's just more blank pages in the photo album where it stops. And right after that, the screen just goes black. And so it's not some gradual kind of fade out. What I thought was really interesting about that is it kind of parallels how sudden these things can be. Also, the soundtrack. Personally, for me, I thought the soundtrack was pretty effective because it really kind of intensified some of those really emotional moments, whether you're talking about it playing while there's footage of homeless people, or it's playing during interviews with family members of people who've had mental illness. And so it's those moments where it kind of increases that tension, that emotional impact of the scene. And then last but not least, they include interviews of people with mental illness and their families. And what's really interesting about this is it shows not only the person's perspective, but also the family member's perspective, because oftentimes family members are the first line of defense in getting someone the help they need. And so one of the people that's interviewed is Patrice Cullors. She is actually a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement. And her brother Monty has schizophrenia. Because of his schizophrenia, he actually ended up going to prison because he, I think, stole something from a convenience store, if I remember correctly. But nonetheless, he ended up in prison and he wasn't treated very well there. And so we see her talk about, trying to get him some help long term. What does that look like? How many meds is he taking? Things like that. So I really liked this quote from her. She says, "Shame is dangerous because shame makes you hide things. And when we hide things, we don't get the support we need. And when we hide things, we're not as honest and transparent about our needs." And I think that shame literally kills people. Shame kills our possibilities of having something different. And so here you can see a picture of her during the interview, but that moment right there, I thought was really, really powerful, because she's talking about how people with these types of illnesses often feel like they have to hide what they're going through. Okay, and then special techniques used to maximize effect. This took me a little bit to figure out, but I had to think about the bigger picture. So one of the techniques, other than clearly the traditional advertising campaign that they used, things like Twitter and news stories, was access to the film. First, it was streamed on PBS, because Independent Lens is a branch of PBS. But then after that, it's really kind of hard to find it because it's not on any kind of streaming services. Like, I checked Netflix and Amazon, iTunes. I'm missing, there was one more that I checked. I think it was Hulu, but I couldn't find it. Because we had it at one point. Mom had recorded it on the TV for me, so I was going to watch it later, but then it got deleted. And so I started thinking about it. I was like, well, what am I going to do? And I had emailed the contact on the website and said, hey, here's who I am. Here's what I'm doing. Can you please help me find access to this? But thankfully, our librarians were able to find it for me because we have a ProQuest subscription. And so that's what you see here. Go through a university, you can do it that way. You can also purchase a DVD if you want to spend $95. You don't want to know how much the university subscription is. It's very expensive. Or you can also host a public screening. And what I thought was really interesting about this was, at first it was kind of frustrating because I really hope that I can get to this because I really, really want to use this film. But the more I started thinking about it, it's kind of cool, because think about the difference between me watching it on Netflix versus hosting a public screening. There's going to be a lot more post-film conversation if I'm sitting there with a group of community members talking about, hey, what did you think of the film? How do you feel about stigma now? Things like that. And so I think that was probably a smart choice on their part. First of all, for copyright reasons, they didn't want anybody to kidnap the film, but also because it will lead to more public discourse around the film. Okay, and then audience reaction to various techniques. Personally, for me, I thought the techniques were pretty effective, especially when Patrice is talking about her brother. I got a little bit teary on that one because I can't imagine, trying to help a sibling and not being able to help them. This user, she was on Twitter, and she kind of said the same thing. So that's why I included this quote. She said, #Little Monsters may be my favorite #Sundance film, but the doc #Bedlam is the most necessary. There were tears and sniffles throughout, not because of any cheap trick, but because the subjects suffering from mental illness were in such pain. And director Kenneth Paul Rosenberg made a damn good case for why their pain was completely unnecessary. It was in large part the result of a system and a set of values that was more invested in stigmatizing mental illness than in actually investing in good care. And so I thought this was really kind of cool because I was scrolling through Twitter going, surely someone else had the same reaction. And I finally found this quote from her. I had to keep scrolling back until October of last year, I think is when it came out. But nonetheless, it was really kind of cool to see someone else's reaction. Granted, this is not talking about the specific moments or the techniques, but just kind of her reaction overall. But anyway, it was kind of neat. Okay, counter propaganda. There really wasn't any documentaries that feature counter propaganda, but I could see some directions it could take. First and foremost, it could talk about how correlation doesn't mean causation. We talk about this a lot in our research methods classes, but basically, just because someone has mental illness doesn't necessarily mean that's why they're homeless. There could be any number of other factors impacting that problem. Also, counter-propaganda could blame the person as much as the system, depending on how they view mental illness and whether they've had experience with it or not. So I could see someone saying, well, it's their fault that they don't stay on their meds, it's their fault that they don't get treatment, things like that, when in reality, it could be partially the fact that treatment could be expensive. So I could see that being a possible route for propaganda. Okay, and then effects and evaluation. This was actually my favorite section to write. I got really into it as I was working, but let me take you through this. So overall, the critics seem to agree that this film was important and it was necessary, but they kind of had some disagreement on some things. First of all, the impact of the film. So some critics were saying this film, has this sense of urgency and it makes me want to take action. And others were saying, well, this is good, but I really don't think it's that urgent. Like, I don't think you've sold me on the fact that this is an urgent problem. Also, one critic was talking about the underlying logic of the film because she pointed out kind of the same thing I did about the either or fallacy, especially when Rosenberg makes it seem like we can either handle the situation the way we are now, or we can go back to institutions. That's an either or fallacy because there are multiple ways to approach this problem. And so she points that out and says, listen, like, this logic doesn't make any sense. And when you put those two options next to each other, people are going to go for long-term institutions. She also talks about how the Treatment Advocacy Center helped influence the storyline of this film, while they also promote forced involuntary treatment. They are also known for promoting the myth that people with mental illness are violent, even though that's not true. They are more likely to be the victims of violent crimes instead of the perpetrators. But this, to me, was really not surprising, especially considering some of the things that I've seen from Trump recently about, we need to go back to institutions because it will stop the mass shootings and all those stuff. That's not necessarily true. So it was kind of sad to me, honestly, not surprising, but sad that the same center who is influencing the storyline of this documentary is over here saying that we need to force people to have treatment and, these people are violent. That seems completely counterintuitive. But nonetheless, her review is really, really interesting and done really well. Another thing to think about is inclusion. There were many organizations that are civil rights or disability organizations that came out and said, well, you didn't even bother to include us in the film. And so they were pretty frustrated with it. And they even ended up sending a letter to PBS talking about, we should have a voice here because we are doing the best we can given the circumstances that we are in. And so I thought that was really interesting. Even if it wasn't an actual documentary, as far as counter-propaganda goes, it was still a form of counter-propaganda. Oh, and two more criticisms that I had. First of all, I think it would have been more beneficial for Rosenberg's argument to skip showing the footage of the mental health hospitals being demolished and include more footage of people being homeless, because it seemed like it was focusing too much on the past. Like, clearly the history of how we got here is important, but I think it would have been better to show me more of what's happening in the moment. Like, why does this matter now? And then another thing I think would have helped is focusing on one person's story at a time, because it ended up kind of going back and forth. And for the most part, I could keep up, but every once in a while, I was kind of like, wait, who is this? What's happening here? And so I think that's something that could be done differently as well. And then this is just my references. So I will just submit this in the PowerPoint. But other than that, that's all I have. Thanks for listening. Bye.